The Arab Spring and Governmental Trust. Using the Arab Barometer, I will be examining which aspect of perceived governmental effectiveness affects governmental trust the most. The rationale behind my research is derived from the literature on the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring is a wave of protests in the Arab world, which in some cases has led to an overthrowing of governments due to the dissatisfaction with local governance. This has caused protesters to aim at the Turkish model for governance, which contains all tenets of democracy but purely based on an Islamic government. From my previous presentation, I found that the strongest predictor of dissatisfaction with democracy was due to the incompatibility with Islam. Therefore, the Turkish model is a perfect fit. By looking at the Arab Spring from a current government's point of view, it is vital to identify which aspect of governmental effectiveness is the strongest predictor of governmental trust, and to strengthen that aspect of it. In order to investigate this, I will be testing 7 hypotheses. The first hypothesis that I will test is that an increase in the effectiveness of government will positively affect the trust in that government. H2 is that positive attitudes towards democratic rule will positively affect perceived effectiveness of the government. H3 is that an increase in perception of safety will positively affect perceived effectiveness of the government. H4 is that a perception of free elections will positively affect the perceived effectiveness of the government. H5 is that a perception of less corruption in the country will positively affect the perceived effectiveness of the government. And H6 is that a higher education will negatively affect perceived effectiveness of the government. And H7 is that an increase in national economic situation will positively affect the perceived effectiveness of the government. It is important to note that if H1 holds, I will also investigate which of H2 through H7 is the strongest predictor. I will stage my analysis in 2 parts, first to see whether H1 holds, and secondly to identify which aspect of perceived effectiveness is the strongest. The first dependent variable that I will be measuring is trust in the government, and a series of indicators were combined into an index, and the reliability analysis shows that the alpha score is 0.78. This indicates that the questions are related enough to combine into an index. Each variable in this analysis was recoded to give positive attitudes a high value. The variable governmental effectiveness will be used in the first part of my analysis as the independent variable, and in the second half as the dependent variable, and it is an index comprised of several indicators representing different views on the current governmental effectiveness. The alpha is 0.82 and will not rise if any one of the indicators are deleted. To test each of my hypotheses, the following independent variables were used: positive attitudes towards democratic rule, high level of safety, fair elections, low corruption, high education, and a good economy. When testing whether governmental effectiveness affects trust in the government, a regression analysis is performed. By looking at the unstandardized regression coefficient B, it can be observed that a unit change in perceived governmental effectiveness will lead to a half a unit change in trust in the positive direction. Therefore, the more people believe that their government is effective, the more trust they will have in that government. This supports my first hypothesis. And this accounts for 18.2% of variation in the dependent variable, as well as having a highly significant F value, concluding that the differences in the sample are highly representative of the population and not likely due to chance. Since H1 holds and the governmental effectiveness positively affects trust, the rest of the hypotheses can now be tested. When looking at the comparative standardized regression coefficient beta, all of the values except for education are positive, which means that democracy, corruption, safety, economy, and elections all positively affect the regression equation, and in turn, trust. All of the independent variables are significant. The purpose of the second regression equation is to identify what is the best predictor of governmental effectiveness, and comparatively, this is a strong economy, as it has the highest beta value. Lastly, this equation as a whole represents 21.6% of explained variance in governmental effectiveness. Since the economy was the strongest predictor of governmental effectiveness, H8 can now be introduced, and that an increase in national economic situation will positively affect trust in the government. And we can go back to the first regression and add in the independent variable economy in a hierarchical fashion. When comparing the 2 steps side by side, it can be observed that once the variable economy was added, the beta value for governmental effectiveness dropped, however not by 1/3 of its value, so it is a case of partial explanation. After introducing economy, the explained variance rise to 24.3%, making the equation as a whole a better fit. However, since the comparative beta values of governmental effectiveness remains the strongest, it is important to look at it more closely. In this cross-tabulation between trust and governmental effectiveness, the relationship lies on the main diagonal. The tau b is 0.35 and is very strong and highly significant. To further elaborate on this relationship, a control table is used to control for gender. The tau b value is much higher among the males, although the relationship holds for both males and females. This shows specification. We can now finish off with a path analysis of all of the results, which are all significant. This analysis supports my first hypothesis, and that an increase in the effectiveness of government will positively affect the trust in the government, with a beta value of 0.352. This also supports my second hypothesis, in that positive attitudes towards democratic rule positively affects the perceived effectiveness of the government, with a beta value of 0.099. This analysis also supports my third hypothesis, in that an increase in the perception of safety positively affected the perceived effectiveness of the government, with a beta value of 0.083. This analysis also supports my fourth hypothesis, in that a perception of free elections positively affects the perceived effectiveness of the government, with a beta value of 0.190. This also supports my fifth hypothesis, in that a perception of less corruption positively affects perceived effectiveness of the government, with a beta value of 0.202. This supports my fifth hypothesis, in that higher education negatively affects the perceived effectiveness of the government, with a beta value of negative 0.074. This also supports my seventh hypothesis, and that an increase in the economic situation positively affects the perceived effectiveness of the government. And it also supports the eighth hypothesis, in that an increase in national economic situation positively affects the trust in the government, which is also a case of partial explanation, as the economy is antecedent to both the effectiveness of the government and the trust in the government. Therefore, as all of my hypotheses are supported through this analysis, an increase in the effectiveness of the government leads to increase in trust in government. The strongest predictor of that effectiveness is a strong economy, which was exhibited in elaboration through partial explanation, as the economic situation is antecedent to both perceived effectiveness and trust in the government. The political implications of this study is the ability of the generalizability to the Arab world. In order to avoid uprising, the Arab governments must increase their economy, which in turn can translate to higher governmental trust and lower possibility for an uprising.